Good afternoon. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Washington Institute, and it is my happy task today to make very brief opening remarks, welcoming today's program, congratulating the authors of today's map, interactive map that we are releasing, and underscoring the value of why we are doing what we are doing. We at the Washington Institute, like many other think tanks, produce a lot of material. In fact, we just published our 3,300th Policy Watch. But every once in a while, we create something which underscores the fundamental value proposition of why we are in business, why we do what we do. And today's event is just that sort of moment. By producing the Lebanese Hezbollah worldwide activity, select worldwide activity interactive map, we bring to practitioners, policy analysts, scholars, journalists, diplomats, people concerned with terrorism around the world, we bring in a user-friendly, hands-on, insightful, and incisive way information that exists nowhere else in a single place in the world. And being able to do that, I believe, is an enormous contribution to the policymaking process. I want to take this moment to congratulate my colleague, Matt Levitt, better known as Mapu Levitt, who has created this, this remarkable tool, along with an army of support from researchers, editors, and technical assistants here at the Washington Institute. I want to congratulate him for bringing his years of expertise on Hezbollah to bear in this path-breaking initiative. I want to congratulate him also for turning 50 today. A half-century of contribution to humankind is no small achievement. Matt, congratulations to you, congratulations to your team, and I'm going to turn the ball over to you to present this fantastic achievement.
Thank you very much, Rob. And let's just state for the record that 50 is the new 30. Projects like these can't happen unless you have top-down support. And at the Washington Institute, we have just that, and I really appreciate it. It makes things like this possible. First of all, I want to thank Kash and Juan for joining us today. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the map, show you a couple of things about the map, and then we'll turn it over to Kash, then to Juan. And then we'll be able to take questions. Questions can be submitted to the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. That's policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. So first of all, what is this product? This is an open source, that is to say, a combination of originally unclassified and originally classified and now declassified materials that we can share with you publicly. And so the first thing to say is we should not confuse this with the sum total of Hezbollah activity around the world. This is the activity that we can talk about in the open source. You can't look at this map and see, well, what did Hezbollah do or not do after the killing of Qasem Soleimani in January? Not only is that too recent, but most of that material is probably highly classified and will be for quite some time. So don't make the mistake of looking at the map and saying, this is the totality of what Hezbollah did. It includes almost 1,000 entries. We actually have 1,000 entries in the data set. They're just not all populated in the map yet. They will be this week. And hundreds of source documents for you to look up the sources on your own. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the origin story here. As many of you know, I wrote my book on Hezbollah in 2013, and the paperback came out with a new chapter in 2014. But as I went around Europe around that time, as the Europeans were deciding whether or not to designate Hezbollah in whole or in part, in the end they designated the terrorist and military wings only, I came up time and time again with two conversations. One conversation was, there's no information out there. Where am I supposed to find this information? There's no one place where I can find this information. And the second was, well, we have some information, but it's all highly classified. There's no declassified information or unclassified information. And I realized that while the book could answer some of that problem set, it's dense, there's a tremendous amount of material there, it's not as user-friendly as an interactive tool might be. So it's taken us 3 years at the Washington Institute, but we have now built this interactive map to be able to make this material more readily available. And now I'm going to share my screen, and walk you through just a little bit of what this map can do. And the map itself will go live when we finish at 2 o'clock Eastern. As you can see, we have a landing page or a splash page here, which has an essay about the map. It's available in executive summary form in multiple languages. We have a video, we have a tutorial, which I recommend people use, detailed Hezbollah analysis, and some recent Hezbollah news. If you click out of that, you'll get into the map itself. And there are 4 ways to search this map, to use this map. The first is this map is completely interactive. So you can zoom in on any place, on any country. You can go anywhere in the world, see what's happening in the Washington area, and you can navigate by geography. You can also navigate by chronology. At the bottom of your screen, every entry has a widget. And more interestingly, below the chronology bar every year, if you were to click on, say, 2008, we'll give you a drop-down menu of all the entries in that year. You can also, in the top right, search by any keyword, a name, a place, a date, a type of activity. For example, you could type in money laundering and get anything that has that entry in there. And that search function is quite sophisticated. It will search every entry in the map, and it will also use a name dictionary that we built so that if you search my name, Matthew, using 1 T or 2 Ts, Muhammad under any spelling, you'll get the hit no matter what. If you do click on an entry, let's go to Paris, France, you will get a variety of options. That gave us 1. Hold on, I just clicked it the wrong way. You go to Paris, France. There we go. You'll get a drop-down menu of all the events associated with this location. Things that happened in Paris, and because it's the capital, things that have to do with France, for which we didn't have another location, including things like a victim, a French citizen victim of a Hezbollah attack, or even a Hezbollah operative who is him or herself a French national. Now, you can also search by event category. And so if you click here, you'll be able to search by plots and attacks, by finance and logistics, by counterterrorism actions. And as you see, each of these have subcategories. They've been coded and secondarily and tertiary coded. And if you were to click on any one of these, a primary or a secondary category, let's click on plots and attacks, you'll get a drop-down menu of everything in that category. And just to give you a sense, as I scroll down, we're dealing with a lot of plots and attacks. Not all of them succeeded. Some of them were thwarted. But all the plots and attacks that Hezbollah has created over time that we were able to document in this map. So what I'd like to do now that I've shown you the basics of the map, you'll be able to play with it yourself shortly, is show you a couple of examples of some new information, some rare or previously unreported or underreported information, and some trends. And then I'd like to turn it over to Kash and to Juan. So for example, many people are aware that Fadi Kassab was the handler, the Hezbollah handler, the supervisor, if you will, for Ali Karani, the Hezbollah operative who was convicted in New York of terrorist charges just about a year ago. What they are not aware of, however, and what we are making public here for the first time, is that according to prosecutors and information that came up in detail in the trial, Fadi Kassab's true name is likely Majid Abdullah. Until now, we've known of several other aliases, but we have not made public his true name, nor have we made public the fact that he is, according to other Hezbollah operatives, they're not sure if he's what European nationality and Lebanese also dual national, but possibly British. Another example of information that we're providing for the first time is the fact that when Hezbollah decided to store ammonium nitrate ice packs at a safe house in Cyprus, they bought the house as opposed to renting it for operational security reasons. But the person who bought the house for them was a Lebanese-French dual national who was a professor at a university in Lyon at the time. This professor has since fled to Lebanon, and we make this professor's name public here. There's an open indictment for him. None of this is classified. You just have to go travel the world, as I've done, and get those court documents, interview those police officers, those case agents, and present that material in one place. I'll give you another example, which actually has a connection literally to today on Meliad Farah, one of the people who's been indicted for the bombing in Burgas, Bulgaria. It's related to today because just today, Her Majesty's Treasury in the UK renewed their designation of Meliad Farah, along with several other Lebanese Hezbollah, Saudi Hezbollah, and Iranian operatives. Most of the press reporting that you will find on the travels of Meliad Farah and his co-conspirators from Lebanon to Bulgaria, and then also from Bulgaria home, minus the one who died in the attack, is wrong. But we now have interviewed the case agents, we've reviewed the court documents, and we can present to you how they did travel, and through the use of spider lines, as we call them, we can actually show you the order of operations, how people moved from one place to the other. Those are just some examples of some of the new information that we've included here, but there's also a tremendous amount of rare or previously undisclosed information, and a lot of that has to do with CIA, FBI, and other material that is now declassified and can be made public. I'll give you one really esoteric example, just to make a point. In April 1992, the CIA wrote a report on Iran, enhanced terrorist capabilities and expanding target selection. We make that report in its redacted form available to you here. The relevant portion we highlight for you here, you can click on it. As of late 1990, Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad began planning a joint operation against Jewish emigres at a Warsaw synagogue and the Budapest airport. These attacks didn't happen. That seems to me this is when Iran was trying to get Palestinian Islamic Jihad to be more transnational, and ultimately they said no thank you. But at one point in late 1990, Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah were jointly plotting operations targeting Jewish emigres at a synagogue, according to the CIA. I'll give you an example now from some declassified FBI material having to do, for example, with Hezbollah activity in networks on the west coast of the United States. According to a declassified 1994 FBI report, which is not just on Hezbollah, it's on international radical fundamentalism, an analytical overview of groups and trends, Hezbollah operatives on the West Coast initiated a neighborhood watch program in order to alert cell members to FBI or other law enforcement presence. Again, you can click on the relevant portion here, or as in all of these cases, we provide the document. You can click on the document itself, you can download it, you can print it. We don't provide entire documents here because most of it is not about Hezbollah. We provide all of the section in this case that is about Hezbollah. In other cases, Alberto Nisman's 2006 report on Hezbollah and the Amia bombing in Buenos Aires, we provide you all 675 pages of that report in its English translation. There are some other cases that are underreported, but are very relevant to today. So for example, according to Dutch intelligence, Hezbollah operatives are suspected of having conducted surveillance of the new Special Tribunal for Lebanon headquarters, ironically located at the former headquarters of the Dutch intelligence service in the Netherlands in 2010. This is relevant in particular to today. Today is August 3rd, later this week, I believe on August 7th, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon is supposed to announce its ruling, its finding, in the case of 4 Hezbollah members accused of carrying out the assassination of Rafik Hariri and several others. As you can see here, by the way, we have the capability of zooming in or zooming out. In this case, we've zoomed in quite closely in the Netherlands. In other cases, we can zoom out quite far to show you the international links of different types of activities. There are a variety of other incidents here that are underreported. For example, the 2015 Hezbollah plot that was thwarted in Kuwait, where Hezbollah was stockpiling tremendous amounts of explosives. Or 2 years later, the March 2017 plot in Bolivia, just to give you a sense of how even in recent years, Hezbollah is active in an operational sense, not just in the Levant, but beyond, in this case, in the Gulf and in South America. And finally, I'd like to highlight for you just a couple of quick trends, and there are many, many more that you can point out, but I'd like to highlight just a few. So, for example, if you look at one of the most significant Hezbollah illicit finance, money laundering, narcotics trafficking networks that exists today, involving people like Mohammed Bazi, designated by the Treasury, his son Wael Bazi, the Tajuddin brothers, Adam Tabaja, and others, if you kind of overlay all of these over each other, which, by the way, you can do just by looking at the open source material from Treasury and other sources, but not in a visual way the way you can with this map, what you will see over and over again is touch points in Belgium and France. And one of the things that shows us is that Hezbollah has not been particularly dissuaded from continuing to carry out activities in Europe since the partial designation of just its terrorist wing in July 2013. And you don't need to take my word for that. Europol came to that conclusion itself in its most recent terrorism report, the TSAT report, where it found that Hezbollah is suspected of trafficking diamonds and drugs and of money laundering via the trade in secondhand cars. Capital is sent to Lebanon through the banking system, but also through physical transport of cash via commercial aviation. And again, don't take my word for it. Read the document. This is a long document, so you'll notice we tell you here it's on page 23 to save you the time. And finally, I think there's a significant uptick in the past few years in Hezbollah activity related to narcotics trafficking. Not so much in the production of drugs, though there is some of that, especially knockoff things like Captagon in the region. But as you look at the increased activity of Hezbollah narcotics trade around the world, especially with the drop in the price of oil, with the sanctions against Iran, and of course now the coronavirus, there are a variety of cases, very recent cases that drive this home. The most recent of which was the extradition of Rassan Diab from Cyprus to the United States, to Miami specifically, an extremely important case that is tied to several others. And if you're interested in those, you can navigate the map and find them out. One of the things we provide you at the bottom of every entry is a See Also section, other related cases that we have in the map. Every entry has the ability to send us an email of what you think about the entry, an ability to save a link, not just to the map, but to that specific entry, to zoom in to the related entries on the spider links or back out to the core area. A project like this is not possible without the help of a lot of people. And so I just want to very quickly, though I can't thank everybody, I do want to say that the Washington Institute publications and communications teams have been second to none. Maria, Scott, and Corey in particular, not only, but in particular, have been people in touch with them almost daily. The team at International Mapping, which built the actual map, we contracted to them for the map, were incredible. Kevin and Mike in particular. If you need to build a map, go to International Mapping. The team of researchers in the Reinhard Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence at the Washington Institute, Avi Bass, Hannah Labau, David Patkin, and many others did the hard work of making this possible. Most of all, Samantha Stern, my research assistant and mapping expert par excellence, without whom this map would not have happened. So thank you, Samantha. And I will just say that Samantha put into practice, made a reality out of a vision that my very good friend, Mary Kalbach-Haran, who was the publications director at the Washington Institute from 2008 to 2019, and was taken from us much too early last year by cancer. Mary had the vision for this map. I did not. She had to convince me of its utility. If it was not for her, this map would not have happened. And Sam is ultimately the one who took her vision and made it a reality. So I want to thank everybody who helped contribute to the ability to make this map. I want to thank everybody who's participating today. I want to thank my co-panelists. I'm going to stop talking now, mute myself, which those of you who know me is a lot coming from me, and turn it over to Kash, and then after Kash to Juan, and then we will take your questions, which you can start submitting already at the address policy forum at washingtoninstitute.org. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. Hope you all can hear me now. Outstanding map. I'm going to go off script just for a second and say that is a pretty kick-ass map, and your team did a wonderful job there. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of this event today. Matt, I'd like to thank you and the Washington Institute for inviting us here today and getting this great group of folks together. Few people on the planet know Hezbollah better than Matt, and his testimony on worldwide Hezbollah cases has been critical to disrupting the group's activities around the world. In my role as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterterrorism here at the White House, my team works to implement President Trump's policy to counter, disrupt, and sanction Hezbollah, Hezbollah's global terrorist activities. Broadly speaking, the map Matt has created demonstrates several points in sharp relief. For example, 1, Hezbollah is a terrorist group, root and branch. The United States designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization in 1997 in its entirety. For more than 20 years, we have rejected the false distinction between its military wing and purported political wing. We see no difference. We are encouraging the international community to join us in recognizing this group for what it is. 2, Hezbollah's global reach. The Trump administration recognized from the outset that Hezbollah is the Iranian regime's most dangerous and capable terrorist proxy. For years, the group's operatives have been gathering intelligence and stockpiling weapons, building explosives, and unfortunately carrying out attacks across Europe, Asia, and Africa, and North and South America. Hezbollah is abusing the global financial system to support itself. In addition to the hundreds of millions of dollars per year that Hezbollah receives from Iran, these illicit funding schemes and networks provide Hezbollah with the resources it needs to conduct their terrorist attacks. 3, the Trump administration believes the swift domestic and international action is needed to disrupt the group's activities that Matt described today. To that end, the administration has designated or sanctioned many individuals and entities supporting the group. Internationally speaking, I'd like to highlight a few things. We work closely with the German government to ban Hezbollah's activities there, a decision Germany announced this past April, and are encouraging our other EU partners to do the same. Last year, for example, the United Kingdom designated the group in its entirety. And in June, Kosovo added Hezbollah in its entirety to their list of terrorist organizations. We are encouraging our Western Balkan countries to do the same. Closer to home, Argentina, Colombia, Paraguay, and Honduras have designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Unfortunately, this is not enough, and there is more work that needs to be done against Hezbollah by our European partners and our allies across the world to encourage them to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist group and shut down the group's terrorist activities. So in closing, Matt, again, thank you for having me here. This project is amazing, and I'm so happy to see its fruition and be a very small part of it. I'm confident here at the White House we can serve to assist you in this process and help raise awareness for Hezbollah's activities. In closing, I'd just like to sort of piggyback off Matt and thank Tim Agent, who is our director here for Iranian-sponsored terrorist organizations. He's really the White House and National Security's brain trust for Hezbollah and other matters. And I hope that the community utilizes him should they need, because he's our resident expert, and we're fortunate to have him. So thank Tim and the community. And Juan, thanks for joining as well. I look forward to engaging in a dialogue. Thanks very much. Over.
Matt, I want to thank you and Rob and the Washington Institute for inviting me. Really an honor and a privilege. Rob, Matt, you know how much I admire the work of the Washington Institute. I think the release of the map is just further evidence of the great scholarship that comes out of WINEP on a daily basis. And Matt, this is a great reflection of your scholarship as well as your background as an FBI analyst, high-level Treasury intelligence official. This map, as you've just shown it to the audience, really reflects the depth of your expertise and years of experience, not just in thinking about Hezbollah, but thinking about global terrorist organizations and how they operate. So congratulations to you and the team on this event. And Kash, it's very nice being on the panel with you. Thanks for all the work you're doing. Maps, I think, are critical, Matt, and you've described it. I think maps today are important ways of conveying information at a time when we are both deluged with information and short on our memory. And I think maps have a real interesting and important way of consolidating information, illuminating that information, and enabling what's done with that information. What's fascinating about the map, and to the audience, I've had a chance to play with the map thanks to Matt over the weekend. There's phenomenal curation of information, as you saw some examples on Matt's demo there for us. Primary documents, source documents, information from authorities, as well as think tanks and others that really begin to give shape to the information on the map. It's illuminating. It's illuminating from the perspective of not just revealing identities, as Matt has just done today, but revealing links, revealing operations and activities in parts of the world that you may not have been aware of, and certainly may not know that Hezbollah operates in. And it's enabling in that it does exactly what Matt describes. It puts in one place the ability of authorities, regulators, private sector, scholars, those who are interested in this issue, the ability to understand these issues and ask hard questions. Maps have the ability of opening the aperture of the imagination to ask what's next, what more, why isn't there more information about this or that. So the map itself is a phenomenal function. And I just want to harken back to a story when I was back at the White House, like Kash, with President Bush in the second term of his administration. President Bush actually bemoaned the fact that we didn't have a map for the war on terror. The fact that we didn't have the ability, as he would say, to put pins on the map the way that you would ordinarily in a war, for example, World War II. And so we tried as much as possible to give visuals to what was happening around the world, but there was no interactive map of the type that WINEP has just published. And in fact, we looked, and Rob, you will appreciate this, we looked very closely at the Darfur Holocaust Museum map that was put out in about 2006 as a great example and the forerunner of the kinds of maps that we would want to see that would expose evil doing, that would expose national security risks. This is something put out by the Satellite Sentinel project run by George Clooney and John Prendergast in combination with the Holocaust Museum and Google Earth capabilities. So that was, in our mind, sort of the first reflection of a very interesting map put together for national security reasons. And I had always hoped that we would begin to see maps of the sort that Matt has just published to be able to illuminate what's happening in the world. So kudos to you again, Matt. Just maybe a final thought on what the map reveals about Hezbollah and really begins to pierce some of the mythology, if not orthodoxy, that you hear in other parts of the world around what Hezbollah is or is not. The map clearly reflects that Hezbollah is a global organization. It is not just an organization based in Lebanon or the Levant. It has links, capabilities, reach, and history around the world. The map reflects that clearly. It also describes the scope and demonstrates the scope of Hezbollah activity, not just terrorist activities, but intelligence activities, financial activity, criminal activities. To Matt's point earlier, the operational capabilities of this group beyond Lebanon. And finally, it describes the history and demonstrates the history of this group. Again, with very short memories, especially here in the West, it's important to reflect the fact that there are histories of operatives, attacks, arrests, a whole series of actions and counteractions that have happened over time around the world. This will be important as Hezbollah evolves its capabilities. And again, Matt, this gives us a landing page from which then to ask hard questions. What's next for Lebanon as Lebanon and Hezbollah as the crisis unfolds in that country? What more will Hezbollah do as a terrorist proxy for Iran as those capabilities expand globally? And what will Hezbollah do to evolve its capabilities well beyond its locality, whether it's with information and media operations, kidnapping activities, other terrorist activities? And Matt, to your point, what will the pressure of the economic campaigns against Iran and the crisis in Lebanon mean for its financing? All of these are questions and issues that can be explored and drawn from, given the map that Matt has now launched. So Matt, thank you very much for including me. It's great to see a map of this nature emerge. And now there's just a lot more work to keep this map up to date and relevant. And I know there's going to be a lot of listeners and readers who are going to be interested in how this evolves. Thank you.
Kash, Juan, thank you both very much for those very, very kind comments. I look forward to everyone else, once we launch 2, being able to play with the map and get their feedback. So we'll jump right into the questions. We have quite a few already. Again, you can submit questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. There are a lot of questions about how we built the map or how it's working. I'll answer a bunch of them, but not all of them, because we get into a tremendous amount of detail answering these questions in the introductory essay of the map. And I don't want to take time if you get into the weeds when you can read about that, but I'll answer a few. So where can we find a list of the data sources? Is there a way to isolate government actions such as Treasury actions? So there are 4 ways to search the map: geographically, chronologically, keyword, and those categories. If you go into the 3 categories, plots and attacks, finance and logistics, and counterterrorism actions, we've already sorted and coded it out for you. And so one of the counterterrorism actions is designations or prescriptions. And you'll be able to go in there and you'll be able to get a drop-down menu of all of the designations or prescriptions. We'll tell you when they're US Treasury or when they're someone else's. As Kash mentioned, there have been a variety of other countries that have done designations. Some of them, like the UK and Australia, Canada, sometimes their statements are very, very relevant. The list of the data sources, we have not yet created a list of every source that's in the map. That's on the list of things we want to do going forward. But every entry has its sources, and they're all there for you to look at as you go through the entries. But one thing that I think it will be useful for us to do is create a list for everybody of all the sources so that you can go through those without having to go through the entries if you're interested in searching that way. A great question is, how many entries are in the database? How often will you be updating the database? So in the top left-hand corner of the map, right behind under our Washington Institute logo, and right above those 3 categories that are searchable, we have a widget that tells you exactly when you go into the map how many entries are in the map. I believe that right now it's 933, and exactly when it was last updated to the minute. And it's going to be important for people to look at that when they're citing to the map, because this is an iterative process. We will be adding things. New information will come out and will reveal that what was previously known, what was previously reported by government or whatever, turns out not to have been 100%. That happens sometimes. Or maybe we'll get some entry a little bit wrong. We've vetted pretty carefully, but anything's possible. We will go in and we will make these edits. We will make additional entries. There are entries right now that don't yet have documents. We are in the process of adding all those in. So when people cite to it, they should cite to the last updated at widget in the top left-hand corner. There's no automatic amount of time or when we're going to be updating. I can tell you we have about 200 more entries that we're in the process of writing, vetting, editing, and then including over the next days and weeks. We are working on it daily. And then moving forward, it'll probably get to the point where we only need to invest about an hour a day in it, updating entries, updating the links for recent events, updating some of the links to a detailed analysis, etc. Can people submit information, submit documents, submit feedback? Absolutely. And in fact, we've created 2 different ways for you to do that. On the page itself, in the bottom left, there are several widgets. One of them is a mail icon. And if you click on that icon, we've created an email address for this map at the Washington Institute. It will populate an email, populate the address, and you can share any information you want. But more than that, every single entry has a few widgets at the top of that entry. One of them is a mail widget. And you click on that, it will not only populate, generate an email, populating it to the proper address. The subject line will be the subject, the title of that entry, and you'll be able to feed us back information about that particular entry. Now, I imagine that we will get a lot of people saying, hey, I have more documents for you, and that would be much, much appreciated. No one should expect that we're just going to take something in an email 3 minutes later, put it in the map. We're doing our due diligence and vetting on everything that we've done here. It's why it's taken us years, and we're going to do that with any information that comes in going forward. But we very much do encourage people's participation in this project. Another question, for all the global activity, are you surprised that Hezbollah doesn't seem to devote more of its violent activities to attacks in Israel proper? It's a very interesting question. Hezbollah is, of course, multiple things. It's a political organization, a social organization, it's a military organization, it's a criminal organization, it's a terrorist organization. Hezbollah as a military organization does lots of things involving Israel. Those things are ongoing just over the weekend and last week and today. But Hezbollah also does a lot of things targeting Israel involving its terrorist wing. Often that involves activity abroad, but not only. And so the person who asked this question, I encourage you to look at the map, and what you will find is a huge number of incidents where Hezbollah is trying to recruit people who are foreign nationals of other countries from Europe, from Southeast Asia, from Australia, from the United States, to then use that foreign passport to get into Israel, either to collect intelligence or in many cases to carry out operations, where they try to recruit Israeli Arab citizens of Israel who are Arabs and therefore can travel anywhere, and trying to recruit them to carry out attacks, operations, etc. In fact, on this day, on August 3rd, a few decades ago, Hezbollah had an operation just like this. I just tweeted out about it earlier today, trying to smuggle explosives into Israel across the border, the blue line, through a drug network. So I think you'll find there are quite a few of those. What are you doing to get this out as a resource to academic counterterrorism programs, St. Andrews, Johns Hopkins, etc.? So we're liaising with lots of different groups. I've done a lot of pre-publication outreach. If you count this, I think this is my 45th briefing of the map prior to launch. And so we are getting this out as much as possible. This is a free tool. I briefed one company that's making a similar tool related to a different terrorist group, and they're charging a lot of money for it. We're charging nothing. Go out there, use it, decide for yourselves based on the entries and the documents. Give us your feedback, but we want to make it as widely accessible as possible. Please do feel free to share. What's the cutoff date of information currently in the map? Again, it will tell you when you go to the map what the most recent update is, and we'll be doing that going forward. Let's see here. Has the reimposition of sanctions by the United States on Iran had any influence in diminishing their funding of Hezbollah and other groups? So this is an interesting question, and it's quite a serious debate. I'm of the opinion, and I would encourage Kash to jump in on any of these, especially the ones that aren't how did you make the map. But on this one in particular, I'm of the opinion that it has had a very significant impact. I think it's one of the reasons you're seeing Hezbollah get even more involved in things like money laundering, narco trafficking. I think it's quite clear that Iran still has the funds it needs to support groups like Hezbollah, and it's doing that. It is prioritizing the war in Syria, so a lot of that money is going there. But the budgets aren't quite, the same as they used to be. These things are never standard. The U.S. government has reported that Iranian support to Hezbollah has been as much as $700 to $800 million a year. I think it's safe to assume it's less than that right now, not because they don't want to, but because they're not able. That doesn't mean that Hezbollah can't carry out attacks. Attacks, unfortunately, are fairly inexpensive, but it does mean that they've had to close down offices, that they've had to pay fewer salaries and smaller salaries. It does mean that we've constricted the operating environment for them in a lot of different ways. And so I do think it has had an impact, although it doesn't mean that we have strangled Hezbollah financially. Juan or Kash, would either of you like to jump in there?
Sure. I would agree with what Matt said about sanctions, and I would just offer the following. Sanctions are a tool against foreign terrorist organizations. They are not the tool to remove and destroy foreign terrorist organizations. Sanctions regimes under President Trump have been incredibly successful, but they are sort of an item that we use in more of a global campaign against a terrorist organization, and in this case, Lebanese Hezbollah. We supplement that with the great work of our allies in Europe and the great work that Matt and his colleagues are doing to not only raise awareness, but most people, unfortunately, if you go out to the general populace. They've heard of Lebanese Hezbollah, but they're probably not familiar with the amount of killings and terrorist activities they've conducted worldwide. So it's a combination of things that helps us move against such a terrorist organization. And these sanctions are critical, and I agree with Matt that they've been extremely successful. But it's just it's a piece of the puzzle that we're going to keep adding to. Over.
Matt, I would just add to that, that I think over time we've seen, as there's been greater pressure on Iran, there's been a greater propensity by Hezbollah to take advantage of opportunities in the criminal domain and in other dimensions of the illicit economy. And I think some of the early stages of the more complex schemes that you've seen, for example, through Lebanese Canadian Bank, which was designated as a primary money laundering concern under Section 311 of the Patriot Act, that much of that came from periods where the Iranian regime was less able to fully fund Hezbollah. To your point, Matt, I think the Iranians always find a way to fund elements of Hezbollah, but I think you've heard in statements over time from Hezbollah leadership concerns around budgetary restrictions put on the Iranians as a result of the financial pressure campaigns over time, including over the last few years. So I think looking at the map and looking at the history of this, both at the pressure of economic sanctions on Iran, on Hezbollah, looking at the expansion of Hezbollah's financial networks and their schemes, all becomes an interesting part of the inquiry. And I agree with you, Matt and Kash. I think over time what you have is a constriction of that budget and the need for Hezbollah to find other sources of income. Just a final point on sanctions, to Kash's point. I think he's absolutely right that sanctions are only one tool in the toolkit. Certainly the mantra we had when I was at Treasury and at the White House was, what we're trying to do with sanctions is to make it harder, costlier, and riskier for America's enemies to raise and move money around the world. You're never going to fully end sources of funding for a group, or especially from a state sponsor. But if you can make it very hard for them to operate, hard for them to move money, and if you have to make it part of a strategic calculus for the Iranians or Hezbollah to make choices based on budgetary restrictions or constrictions, that is a win from an American foreign policy perspective.
If anybody wants to understand these tools better, they should go and buy first and then read one's book. But please buy it, otherwise.
Thanks, Matt.
I will say that one of the things the map can do is it goes case by case and provides you, as much as we can, court documents, etc. So, for example, consider the arrest in Atlanta, Georgia, of Iman Kobesi after she was lured to the United States, arrested the same day that French authorities in a joint operation arrested Joseph Azmar, two Hezbollah money launderers working around the world, mostly laundering money through Western Europe, France, the UK, etc., engaging with people they thought were part of the US mafia, but unfortunately for them were undercover US agents, and telling them their whole business model. And there's a tremendous amount of evidence now out there about this type of Hezbollah activity. And if you wanted to take a hypothesis of the type that Juan and I and Kash have just put forward and said, well, we think this probably is successful. If you look at periods of time when Iran doesn't have as much money, you'll see Hezbollah increase. You can actually use the map to try and test that. It won't be of all Hezbollah activity. Some of it won't be declassified, but there's a tremendous amount that you can use to test it with. That gets us to our next question, where someone asks, excuse me, is there an overlay capability to better identify connections between nodes in the network? So this is something we spent a tremendous amount of time debating. We spent a lot of time not on what I consider the fun stuff, the substance and the mapping, but what are the rules? What's the methodology? In what case do you have spider lines? What's the rule for when you do, when you don't, etc.? And we had the capability of doing heat mapping. We had the capability of doing some type of overlay. But what we found was that it created some false impressions related to the fact that this is not all the data that's out there on Hezbollah. The only type of heat mapping by default that we include in here is, if you recall, when I clicked on those categories, whether it was the primary category of plots and attacks, or any of the subcategories under there, just the assassinations, or just the hijackings, or just kidnappings, that what happens is not only do you get a drop-down menu of just those entries that fit that category, but the map actually kind of depopulates a little bit. And the only dots that remain, large colored dots, are the ones that fit that category, the kidnappings or the hijackings, or if you did it with another category, the designations or use of fake ID. And so you can kind of eyeball that on the map a little bit. That's the only time we allowed ourselves the luxury. The technology was there. We didn't do it. We chose not to do it because we felt that it left the wrong impression. Oh, great. We have a question specifically for one of our guests, a question for Mr. Patel. Mr. Levitt mentioned a drug trafficking uptick. How can information sharing and collaboration best be improved between law enforcement and defense and the intelligence community?
Thanks for the question. As I think, Matt, you alluded to it earlier, the fact that these organizations are using drug trafficking to finance their operation is no surprise. Actually, in my past lifetime when I was a public defender, I had represented clients who were part of a Lebanese Hezbollah Mexican drug cartel financing campaign. And so that has been going on for years and years and years, unfortunately. In terms of collaborative work between us, the interagency amongst the government and the private sector itself, it is critical that we engage in these forums to share this type of information, because as I was talking to my colleague Tim Agent here, this map is something that it's nothing like I've ever seen before on Lebanese Hezbollah and their global operations. And while we do have all these wonderful capabilities to collect against them, as Matt noted earlier, a lot of it's classified. Relying on this collaboration allows us to educate the community and to get better at the touch points we need to stop their next iteration of campaigning or their financing, such as in the drug cartel world. Thank you. Over.
Okay, going on down to questions. Do you accept sources of information other than government sources? And when will your next book on Hezbollah's global footprint come out? I did not put that in there because I'm not doing that anytime soon. It's a big project. You're laughing. My wife is, phew. The answer is we take all kinds of sources. There are copyright issues, and so we can't just throw things up there. If it's a government source, we can put it up there. Otherwise, we seek permission, and you'll find a bunch of incidents where we've already received permission from think tanks or from publishers of journals to be able to put articles up there, material from think tanks. In a couple of instances, the journal said you can't put up the full journal article, but you can put up the abstract. So we're trying to put up as much information as we can. We are going to be going to still more places and people, authors and institutions asking for permission, and we will provide here whatever we're able to do with their permission. But it's absolutely not just government information. Of course, again, we are going to be vetting anything that people do send our way, but we really do encourage people to do this. We have a question here that asks, kind of, I'll be honest, from a partisan perspective, how Republicans and Democrats look at Hezbollah. And I'll just say, as someone who's worked in Republican and Democratic administrations in counterterrorism, and proud to have served in both, that in my experience, counterterrorism is a bipartisan issue, and that a lot of good was done targeting Hezbollah during the Obama administration, and a lot of good has been done targeting Hezbollah during the Trump administration, and that's because Hezbollah is a terrorist group, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. And I'll leave that at that. The next question asks, the Lebanese defense minister threatened today that Hezbollah's dormant cells would act against Israeli interests in Europe in response to the Lebanese attack. What does that mean? I don't know. We'll have to see what that means. I feel a lot of pain and angst for the Lebanese people who are suffering the consequences of a political an economic crisis like none we've ever seen, which ultimately comes down to being the result of massive elite corruption across the political and militant elites of Lebanon. That is to say, this is not only the fault of Hezbollah, plenty of fault falls at the feet of other senior elites in Lebanon, but they are paying the price. And this would be another example of that.
Matt, can I weigh in on this one real fast?
Yes, please.
Yeah, just it's a point about Hezbollah that's interesting because there's a dynamic where Hezbollah wants to demonstrate its legitimacy, has tried to do that obviously with political and social means and capabilities in Lebanon, but Hezbollah has the sort of the unfortunate sort of candor, unfortunate from their perspective, of demonstrating over and over again that it's a terrorist group with global capabilities. And so I haven't read the statement, but to the extent that Hezbollah continues to threaten not just Israeli targets, but as in the case of Bulgaria, European citizens, or through the history of operations in Europe, you look at the German cases in the 90s, et cetera, where Iranian Hezbollah assassins were going after activists. They reveal their true nature. And it's really, from a strategic perspective, a huge mistake for them to even threaten that, in part because it reinforces, especially with European allies, the very nature of this group, the fact that they have operatives working in Europe that need to be monitored and disrupted. And it demonstrates that Hezbollah is a threat to Europe, not just Israel, and not just to adversaries in the Lebanese system. So I take that as a really, candid mistake on their part, but it's a mistake they consistently make because they reveal their true nature.
Follow on that, we have a question for Kash. It's related to this issue. Hezbollah's control over the Lebanese institutions has been possible because of Hezbollah's political allies in the government, our questioner states. Last year, there were several statements made by U.S. officials about designating those allies of Hezbollah in Lebanon. A year later, that has not yet happened. Will it?
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate the question. So, yes, it's no surprise that Hezbollah has allies in the Lebanese government, and that is well published. Our issues between designation and also taking down a terrorist organization, the rub becomes, do we designate an individual who we think will assist us in taking down Hezbollah overall, or do we try to work with that individual in a diplomatic effort to see if he will spearhead efforts in Lebanon to cripple Hezbollah's network? And so, having personally dealt with individuals high up in the Lebanese government on this matter, I can say we have designated some folks over the Trump administration, though, and there are other ones that we are considering. And as you know, the designation process is quite lengthy, so I won't get into the inner workings of the process here, but I think there'll be some good news on the horizon.
A few people have asked if we're at the Washington Institute planning to use this template for other terrorist organizations. Since we haven't even launched this one yet for another 4.5 minutes, I'm not going to commit to doing another 3-year project like this. I will say we are already having this conversation. And having built the tool and developed the methodology and the rules, and it won't take, I would hope, quite as long. But we are looking at the ability to do this with the Al-Qaeda's and the Islamic State, Daesh's, and Quds Force MOIS, Iran Threat Network type of models. Part of it is going to be what kind of feedback we get here. If this proves to be as useful as we're hoping, then that will spur us on to want to do more. It's a huge project, but I appreciate the question. The next questioner asks if the map draws any correlation between Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda, which is a great question. And the answer is yes. There are several entries that point to Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda connections, and we do this very carefully not to make it out to be more than it is, but there are some things there. So if you comb the 9/11 Commission report. I worked the 9/11 at the FBI. There are some things worth reporting. Most of them are caveated and requiring further investigation, but they're worth mentioning. If you look, for example, at the Treasury designation of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi back in the day, Zarqawi was looking to partner with Hezbollah for the purpose of sending operatives into Israel to carry out attacks against Israel. And Zarqawi, who hated Shia, was more than happy to work with Hezbollah if it meant targeting Israel. And so there are several interesting entries like that. On August 7th, one of our participants notes the ruling of the Hariri Tribunal, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, will come in all likelihood there will be convictions. What is the panel's view on how this will impact Hezbollah's behavior, violent and non-violent? Could I ask Juan and Kash for you guys to start on this?
Absolutely. And I had the deep honor of meeting Rafiq Hariri about a year and a half before his assassination. This case has deep resonance in Lebanon, in part because of who Rafiq Hariri was, given the political ramifications, and the very idea of Hezbollah as a resistance movement, which has been at the core of its identity and its legitimacy in Lebanese politics. To the extent that Hezbollah is implicated by what would otherwise be seen as objective indictments by the International Tribunal as having killed Rafiq Hariri, it does huge damage to their credibility as simply a defender of Lebanon against Israel, which has been their core, initial narrative. And so this is hugely important. It also has implications for Syria, given the implications and the involvement of the Assad regime, and does then call into question what the nature of these international relationships are and what Hezbollah's intent and capabilities are moving forward, especially at a time of crisis for Lebanon itself. So I think this has the potential to be strategically quite relevant. That's aside from the question as to whether or not those individuals who are implicated will ever be brought to justice. But it certainly does create that jeopardy for them and raises the question fundamentally of what is Hezbollah now and what is it doing for the Lebanese people and the Lebanese state. An indictment against Hezbollah in this case demonstrates that they're not the defenders of Lebanon the way that they articulate.
Kash, any closing statement?
I would just say I agree with with Juan and you. Unfortunately, in the counterterrorism platform, as you guys well know, it's great to levy that first big win against such a terrorist organization in such a difficult space. But there's going to be so much more to come up behind it to shut down this organization. So I agree with Juan, and I just hope that this is a huge step in towards taking down LH.
I just want to thank you, Kash and Juan, Rob, for joining me today, making this possible. I want to thank again all the people I thanked earlier who worked so hard to make this possible, but I've left the most important thank you for last. And that is, I take great pride in being the Fromer-Wexler Fellow at the Washington Institute and in directing the Reinhard program on counterterrorism and intelligence. These are three families that are just very special people. There are people in this world that you're better for having met. The Fromers, the Wexlers, and the Reinhards are just such people. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. Please log off, go play with the map, give us your feedback. We're looking forward to the conversation. This is the beginning, not the end of the conversation. Everybody have a great day. Be well, be safe, be healthy. Thank you very much.